Tutorials in video games are pretty commonplace these days. Actually, tutorials have been common in games for a long time in one form or another. They've become something of an expected first step, for better or worse, as you begin to explore a new game. They may vary in quality, from being narratively driven in-world experiences or subtle to the point of being invisible, to modal pop-up windows that interrupt gameplay or the dreaded long-winded unskippable expository companion dialogue. But the intent is the same, to teach the player how to play the game. Generally speaking, tutorials are designed to ease the player into the world of a game, and the interactions the player can make with that world or the characters and systems within it. They're used as a gentle on-ramp to suggest what a player might learn as they spend more time with the game. As such, it's pretty rare that a tutorial would be considered difficult, let alone one of the hardest challenges in the game. There's one game, however, that flew off that on-ramp, jumped the median into oncoming traffic, and asked, what if instead of telling the player how they might play, we instead force them to know how to play? In this video, we'll be taking a look at a game that has what many consider to be the most infamous tutorial in gaming.
Overheating.
Driver, originally released on the PlayStation in 1999, is a game in which you play as John Tanner, an undercover detective who, possessed of superior driving skills learned from a previous career driving race cars, works his way up the criminal underworld to infiltrate a high-profile crime syndicate. The plot is right out of the genre films the game draws inspiration from and is fairly entertaining.
You got what's yours, baby.
The narrative sees you traveling to Miami, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York as you're placed in increasingly high-stakes situations with increasingly sinister characters, while unraveling a conspiracy that involves the police, the FBI, criminal overlords, and the very office of the president. The climactic final mission sees you in a chaotic mad dash to safety as you attempt to protect the President of the United States from an all-out assassination attempt, frantically racing to a safe house while a whole army of criminals and corrupt agents try to kill you in broad daylight in a crowded city by playing extreme bumper cars. Don't think about it too much, it's what works within the game mechanics. It's a wild ride full of double-crossing, murder, being sneaky, white-knuckle chases, death-defying stunts, advanced driving maneuvers, dodging police recruited exclusively from demolition derbies, and desperate getaways that come down to the wire. But even if you own this game, even if you played this game, there's a good chance you might not know any of that, because another thing you may remember about this game is that its tutorial was hard as shit. Owing to its filmic inspiration, in particular a scene from the 1978 film fittingly titled The Driver, where a character known only as The Driver proves himself by driving like a maniac in a parking structure, the game begins with a notoriously difficult training mission framed as a test to prove to your new criminal employers that your skills as a getaway driver, or wheelman, are up to snuff before they take you on as their new driver. In fact, the legend of this tutorial continues to this day, often showing up in online discussions on difficult games or tutorials in general. PC Gamer magazine ran an article specifically about it in 2021, and it even features prominently in a recent video posted on the Mercedes-AMG F1 channel where Lewis Hamilton, one of the best F1 drivers of all time, struggles to make any progress in driver's tutorial level. So, let's take an unnecessarily close look at the tutorial that likely accounted for the majority of DualShock controller sales in 1999, see if its reputation is deserved, try to overcome one of gaming's biggest gatekeepers, and find out if we learn anything in the end.
3 years on the department and you're still the best driver I got.
Hey, man! Hey, man! Hey, man! You crazy? You wrecked the car, man!
The tutorial places you in a parking structure, gives you a list of 9 maneuvers to pull off, kicks off a stopwatch, and says, good luck. Well, that's not an entirely fair characterization. It doesn't wish you luck. And there's no escape. I mean, literally, there are no exits. There's 2 doors for people, but how do the cars leave? How did we even get in here? Driver's here to teach, and you're gonna learn. The goal of the mission is to woo your new criminal buddies with burnt rubber and G-forces by performing an actual checklist of stunt driving techniques. Sounds straightforward enough, but there are a few restrictions in place here that are likely going to require some studying before you pass this test. Graze the walls or pillars a few times? That's a fail. Scratch the other parked cars a couple times? That's a fail. Take longer than 60 seconds to perform all the techniques to the strictest standards of police-sanctioned stunt driving? That's a fail. That's right, you only get 60 seconds for the tutorial. To add insult to injury, quite literally, the thugs that are testing you will happily berate you if you don't blow their minds the second they hand you the keys.
Maybe I'll give you a call when I need a ride to the grocery store.
So, let's give this thing a shot and see if this tutorial can toot us into the hearts and minds of these judgmental ne'er-do-wells. First up, the burnout. To the tutorial's credit, it starts you off with a freebie. Burnout is just a primary action mapped to a face button, so push the button for a second and you get credit for it. We're off to a good start. Like the burnout, the handbrake is just another basic input. You do need a bit of speed for this to register, so you can't just tap the button as soon as the clock starts ticking and knock it out, but it's basically another gimme. This doesn't seem so bad. The slalom. We'll come back to this one. The 180 is a little deceptive. As far as I can tell, it's not simply the act of moving the car in a 180-degree arc that triggers the success condition. It only seems to register if you trigger the spin by using the handbrake, which makes me think the code to evaluate this maneuver might not begin recording your attempt until the handbrake button is pressed. As such, this item on the list is a little more confusing than it could be, but once you get the hang of it, it's very easy to pull off. And to be fair, using the handbrake is probably more accurate to how this maneuver would actually be done in a real car, and I feel like they wanted to convey that here. So, fair enough. Now we know how to reliably do a 180. Somewhat counterintuitively, I found the 360 was often harder to pull off while moving instead of doing it from a full stop. I think you'll see in the footage that a lot of my attempts start off with the 360 because that was the most reliable way to get it to register when every second counts. Testing whether or not you can pull it off without using the burnout reveals that you actually can, which makes this one of the more permissive trials in the tutorial. Just lay on the gas and keep turning and it'll eventually register. I also spent some time testing out 360s with larger radii, but the physics make this very difficult, and I never got it to register, so I'm skeptical about this being possible, and assume the game is tracking a much tighter radius when determining success. So the initial burnout 360 seems to be the way to go.
Hey, man! Okay!
The reverse 180 is potentially a bit confusing initially, as your instinct is likely to try using other buttons like burnout or the handbrake, as you did for the regular 180. All this actually requires is for you to build up a little speed going backwards, throw the car into a sharp turn, and that's pretty much it. Speed sounds like it should be easy, but this is another one where the metrics for success are hidden from you. There's no visible speedometer and therefore no obvious speed threshold to hit, but it seems to be faster than you can go from a full stop across the length of this nightmare garage. It also seemed like this could register at varying speeds, particularly while spinning, which makes me wonder if the game is simulating g-forces or accounting for radial acceleration when measuring speed. I'd be a little surprised if that were the case, but the true success condition for this maneuver still isn't 100% clear to me. Just go fast, drift around corners, and this will eventually trigger. The brake test is a bit of a reprieve from some of the previous more difficult maneuvers. Ordered by difficulty, this checklist ain't. This one is of the same ilk as the burnout and handbrake tests in that it's tied to a primary face button action and that you can't just get it for free. Of the 3 push-a-button tricks, this one is the most finicky to trigger as its success condition is the most hazy. It seems like it's either triggered by first hitting a target speed and then slamming on the brakes until you stop, or duration of skid while jamming on the brakes. Either way, build up a decent amount of speed and slam on the brakes with an intensity reserved for when you thought you were bold enough to beat the yellow light and then realized you were not going to beat the yellow light. Success. The lap test is pretty straightforward, but it's one of the more time-consuming trials, which can become a problem when you're frantically trying to get through the checklist on early attempts at the tutorial mission. Drive in a circle, either direction, around the 4 corner pillars and this will be checked off. It turns out you can do the lap backwards too, and it still counts, in case you were wondering. That was fun to find out, but don't ask how many tries this took. Okay, back to the slalom. This isn't as bad as the dramatic smash cut implied, but it's certainly the hardest maneuver to pull off, particularly when you're playing the game for the first time and still getting a feel for the weighty physics of the cars in this game. Initially, you're likely to sideswipe the pillars or ding the cars nefariously placed at the end of both rows of pillars, or take too long delicately weaving through that you don't have time left to do anything else. But once you acclimate to the handling of the car and how to turn around quickly, the slalom isn't particularly difficult. So now that I'd spent some time learning each maneuver individually, it didn't take long to string them together well enough to pass the test and get hired for the job.
You the man. We gonna need you.
But you know what? It felt good, like an actual accomplishment. This introductory tutorial that at first seemed like it had been preventing me from playing the very game it was meant to teach had transcended the age-old pop-up message simply telling me what to do, and instead instilled in me actual physical skill that enabled me to have this new experience. Now that we've triumphed over this boss tier tutorial, let's get to some general thoughts on it. Let's get the bad out of the way first. For those that couldn't or justifiably didn't want to get past this trial by fire, the game basically only had two modes. A free drive mode where only 2 of the 4 cities were available since you needed to progress the campaign to unlock the others, and a collection of minigame scenarios that maybe last a few minutes each. And for a full-priced retail game, I agree that does not seem like a good value proposition. Those of you that have played this game may remember that there is in fact a training mode that you might think would help players get past the tutorial. To be fair, it does show you what a successful run of the tutorial looks like, and shows you what buttons are being pressed when, so you could try to imitate it. But even this training mode has the same damage and time limit restrictions of the first mission, so you still aren't really given a practice area free from judgment to learn your own way. It's interesting to note too that the game has a built-in cheat menu, where certain button combinations on the main menu will enable options to turn off damage or police or both. So you can just sail through the game playing your own way for the most part, but there's no cheat to bypass the tutorial. Even the no damage cheat has no effect in the tutorial. It does seem a bit odd that the rest of the game is this accommodating to a player's preference in how they want to approach the game, but it's all still locked behind the relatively harsh pass-fail premise of the tutorial. Though I think the tutorial makes sense narratively, in terms of breadth of player enjoyment, it likely would have been better to make the tutorial optional. Perhaps frame it as a test with the police lieutenant validating that your skills will pass muster so you don't blow your cover instantly. This way, players who want to engage with the game on its terms can do so, and those that want to just have fun playing around in a getaway driver sandbox could get their money's worth as well. I should mention here that, based on PC Gamer's interview with lead designer Martin Edmondson, the tutorial wasn't made with any malice or intent to gatekeep anyone, and of course, why would it be? Surely they wanted the product to sell and be received well. Instead, it sounds like it was a case of developers becoming so familiar with their own product and playtesting it so many times that their frame of reference for the game's difficulty was far removed from someone playing it for the first time. What they intended to act as a reasonable introduction to the controls and feel of the game accidentally became an imposing barrier to entry for a lot of players. Edmondson is quoted as saying, "I could do that garage in just under 25 seconds, so to me, giving you 60 seconds was plenty of time." Well, it wasn't. Later in the article, when referring back to the tutorial, he says, "Looking back on it, that was a silly decision." Now let's talk about the good aspects of this tutorial, and let's start with a potentially controversial statement. I actually kind of like this tutorial, and I think it's pretty good. If the intent of a tutorial is to teach the player how to play the game, then in my mind this tutorial undoubtedly succeeds in that task. Maybe not in the most pleasant way, but an effective one if you choose to stick with it. The way it essentially forces you to break down this large, daunting task into smaller, more manageable pieces is a great workflow habit to get into for any sizable or overwhelming work item. So I think it's neat that this often maligned tutorial in some way encourages a good mental model for problem solving in general. And the arcade realism style of car handling the developers went for just feels good. Simply driving around itself is fun once you're familiar with the physics engine, and the time you spend in the tutorial all but guarantees that familiarity. Once I had beaten the tutorial, I immediately wanted to go back to see if I could use my newly acquired skills to outperform my previous attempts. And to me that says it did something right, because I wanted to continue engaging with it without any external reward. The inherent satisfaction of being presented with a seemingly insurmountable challenge, to then measurably improve your skills to the point that it becomes trivial, is a powerful feeling, and in many ways speaks to the core of why games are so successful as a form of entertainment. Being able to clear this tutorial in less than half the allotted time, after the initial frustration of feeling like there wasn't enough time to do it at all, is essentially the same thing as trouncing your most hated FromSoft boss after countless failed runbacks. The only difference here is that the boss is a physics engine instead of an eldritch abomination. Although...
You
The theming and in-world context of this tutorial do a lot of heavy lifting too, and set the stakes at a non-trivial level right from the get-go.
I need your badge.
You should feel pressure since you're undercover and at this point in the narrative, unknown and untrusted. And as an ex-racing driver, you should know how to spin these goons around such that they regret eating lunch before coming to test you. It makes for an experience where your arc as a player is more in tune with the arc of the character you're playing, and that brings with it a level of mechanical synchronization and, dare I say, immersion, that you don't always get. The rest of the game is no cakewalk either, but since you've been whipped into shape by the tutorial, you generally feel prepared, in control, and oftentimes like a total badass as you thread the needle of a busy highway at full speed before drifting around a tight corner to lose whoever's tailing you. You're able to react instinctively to the randomness this game will throw at you, since the controls and physics have become second nature by the time you're freed from your concrete crucible. Being able to provide this kind of intense gameplay for the duration of the game is made possible, at least to some extent, by enforcing a solid level of familiarity with the mechanics before letting the player loose. The tutorial succeeds beyond just ensuring familiarity with the driving mechanics too, as though it may not seem like it, the maneuvers it teaches you all have practical uses in the game. Handbrake turns allow you to take corners at high speed, the reverse 180 is useful for when you get pitted, and the slalom is perhaps your most effective tool to shake police as they're likely to crash into the trees and other vehicles that you weave through like an expert because you went to driving school. This level even ends with you driving into a parking structure, which you would be unable to do had you not spent all that time practicing parking structures at the start. Now, to be clear, it's not my intention to make light of or downplay the plight of anyone who got this game for Christmas, played it for an hour, and gave up in disappointment. It's a hard mission for being the first thing you do. Honestly, when I first played this game years ago, I was filtered by the tutorial. I gave up on this game the first time I tried to play it. It was only after some time had passed when I came back for more, with a stubborn refusal to be beaten by this hobby I claim to enjoy, that I managed to get on this tutorial's wavelength and finally succeed, after putting in a little time investment. But I didn't feel like that time was wasted, since during that time I became proficient in a new skill, admittedly one of questionable value, but I became one with that physics engine, and used all 50 polygons of that Buick Skylark to carve my name into the parking structure as its rightful ruler. This game made me feel like a car.
You the man. We gonna need you.
Okay, so, after all that, is this tutorial really that hard? In an absolute sense, no, not especially. For a tutorial, it's certainly fairly demanding, but the majority of the game is quite difficult, and compared to the campaign's tight time limits, random traffic and police spawns, poorly indicated objective markers, and multi-part missions with persistent damage, the tutorial starts to look downright reasonable. And don't get me wrong, this game is a lot of fun, even today, but a lot of that fun factor, I think, comes from overcoming the difficulty, which this game is not lacking. It might be worth noting here too that this game actually sold very well and received near unanimous praise by players and critics alike, implying that most people must not only have beaten the tutorial, but thought it was acceptable, or at least thought the rest of the game was worth the price of admission. I think the reason this tutorial garnered such a reputation is that, intentionally or not, it made the design decision of tossing out the traditional gentle linear or gradual exponential difficulty curve in favor of a more logarithmic difficulty progression. It's front-loaded, but that allows for a long tail of high-intensity gameplay. Instead of letting players learn at their own pace, it forces them to learn up front, and that is understandably a frustrating way to learn, especially for something that is meant to be enjoyed as entertainment. The first mission is by no means the hardest mission, but as a barrier to entry, it kind of acts like a 9-foot you must be this tall to ride cutout at the entrance to what looks like a really fun ride. And it is a fun ride, made possible in part by the inclusion of a tutorial that truly requires you to be skillful.
You the man.
Hell, even the president himself commented on how great my driving was.
Nice driving, son.
Alright, I hope you enjoyed this needlessly close look at what many consider to be one of the most notorious tutorials in gaming. This was my first real video, and I suspect it shows. So if you watch through to the end, hey, I appreciate it. If you know of any other games where the tutorial might as well be the final boss, or have any other gaming minutiae you'd like discussed, let me know in the comments, and maybe we can do this again sometime.